The morning of March 17, 1963, David Kellerman stepped off a military transport plane at Andrews Air Force Base outside Washington with a leather briefcase handcuffed to his wrist and a photograph in his coat pocket he hadn't looked at in 8 months. The photograph showed his wife Claire standing in their backyard in Alexandria, holding their daughter Emma, both of them smiling at something beyond the camera's frame. He had carried that picture through 14 cities across Eastern Europe, through hotel rooms that smelled of boiled cabbage and state suspicion, through meetings in basements where men spoke in whispers about things that could never be written down. Now, as his feet touched American soil again, all he wanted was to see that same smile in person, to know that some part of his life had remained unchanged while he had been gone. The briefcase contained intelligence reports on Soviet missile deployments in Czechoslovakia. The photograph contained everything else that mattered. He cleared customs with the efficiency of someone who had done this many times before. The officers knew his face, knew not to ask questions about where he had been or what he had seen. Men like David existed in a space between official recognition and complete deniability. His work for the CIA's Directorate of Operations was documented in files that would be burned if anything went wrong, celebrated in meetings that left no minutes if anything went right. He was 34 years old and had spent the last decade learning how to lie in 7 languages, how to memorize documents in a single reading, how to walk through a room and catalog every exit without appearing to look. But he had never learned how to come home. The drive from Andrews to Alexandria took 40 minutes through late winter rain. David sat in the back of an unmarked sedan driven by a junior officer who kept his eyes on the road and his mouth shut. The streets were wet and gray, the sky heavy with clouds that looked like they had been hanging there since he left. Everything seemed smaller than he remembered. The houses, the cars, the trees still bare from winter. Or perhaps he had simply gotten used to the vast emptiness of Eastern European landscapes, where distance itself felt like a form of surveillance. He thought about what he would say to Claire. 8 months was a long time to be away, even by the standards of his profession. They had been married for 9 years, and at least half of that time had been spent in separation. She knew not to ask where he went or what he did. She had signed papers promising her silence, had submitted to background checks that examined her life with more thoroughness than most people examine their own memories. But knowing the rules of secrecy and living with its consequences were different things entirely. He wondered if she was angry, if she had grown tired of being married to a man who disappeared for months and returned with nothing to show for it but exhaustion and stories he could never tell. The house on Maple Avenue looked exactly as he had left it. White colonial style with black shutters, a small front lawn that needed mowing. Claire's blue Chevrolet parked in the driveway. Home. The word felt strange in his mouth, like something translated poorly from another language. He paid the driver, who drove away without ceremony, and stood for a moment on the sidewalk with his single suitcase and his handcuffed briefcase, trying to remember how to be David Kellerman, the husband, instead of David Kellerman, the intelligence officer. He walked to the front door. It was unlocked, which was unusual. Claire was always careful about locks, about security. He had trained her to be careful. He stepped inside and called her name. The silence that answered was wrong. Not the silence of an empty house, but the silence of a house holding its breath. He set down his suitcase slowly, quietly, and moved through the hallway with the particular alertness he had learned in rooms where walls had ears and floors had eyes. The living room was tidy, almost too tidy. Claire's knitting basket was on the coffee table, but the yarn looked untouched. Emma's toys were arranged neatly along the wall, not scattered across the floor as they usually were. The kitchen was clean, no dishes in the sink, no smell of cooking, and then he saw it. On the kitchen table, a single sheet of paper. Official letterhead from the Federal Bureau of Investigation. And beneath it, a handwritten document of approximately 4 pages, the last page bearing Claire's signature in a hand that trembled so badly it was barely legible. David's training told him not to touch anything. His training told him to call his superior officer immediately, to report what he had found, to follow protocol. But his training had never accounted for the moment when protocol and love occupy the same space and only one can survive. He picked up the papers and began to read. The FBI letterhead was dated 3 days ago. It was addressed to Claire Marie Kellerman and informed her that she was required to report to the Washington field office for questioning regarding matters of national security. The language was bureaucratic, cold, specific in its vagueness. It mentioned irregularities in her husband's recent activities abroad. It mentioned concerns about contacts she may have had during his absence. It requested her full cooperation with an ongoing investigation. The handwritten pages were a confession. David read them standing at the kitchen table as rain began to tap against the windows. And with each line he felt something inside him go cold and still, the way water freezes from the surface down. Claire had written that during his absence she had been approached by a man claiming to be from the State Department. The man had questions about David's work, about his travels, about whether he had ever mentioned names or locations. She wrote that she had said she knew nothing, which was true. But the man had been insistent. He had visited 3 times. The last time he had brought a woman with him. Someone who showed Claire photographs of David in Prague, David in Budapest. David walking alongside men whose faces were blurred out, but whose presence suggested something dangerous. The man had told Claire that her husband was under investigation for possible compromise, that he may have been turned by Soviet intelligence, that his loyalty was in question, and that her cooperation in the investigation would be essential to determining the truth. Claire had written that she didn't believe them, but she had also written that she was afraid. Afraid for David, afraid for Emma, afraid of what she didn't understand. And in her fear she had answered questions. She had told them about the times David came home and couldn't sleep, about the times he had nightmares and woke up speaking in Russian, about the one time he had received a phone call in the middle of the night and left the house for 3 hours without explanation. She had told them things that meant nothing to her, but could mean everything to men who were trained to find patterns in chaos. The confession ended with a statement that she had provided this information voluntarily, that she understood it may be used in official proceedings, and that she affirmed its accuracy to the best of her knowledge. Her signature looked like it had been written by someone drowning. David set the papers down carefully, precisely, as if they were made of something that could detonate. His hands were steady. His breathing was controlled. But inside, in the part of him that existed beyond training and discipline, something was breaking apart with the slow inevitability of ice cracking on a frozen lake. He knew what this was. He had seen it before, in other countries, to other people. It was called a compromise operation. You approach the wife of a target and tell her that her husband is suspected of betrayal. You show her evidence that seems damning but proves nothing. You pressure her gently, persistently, until her fear overcomes her judgment. And then you get her to sign a statement that appears voluntary, but has been carefully engineered to include details that can be misinterpreted, recontextualized, weaponized. Once the statement exists, you own both of them. The husband can be confronted with evidence that his wife has cooperated with an investigation into his loyalty. The wife can be told that her statement has implicated her husband in activities that constitute treason. Each can be told that the other's safety depends on their continued cooperation. Fear becomes leverage. Leverage becomes control. And control, in the world of intelligence, is everything. Someone had done this to his family. Someone inside the American intelligence apparatus had targeted his wife with the same techniques used against foreign nationals. And they had done it while he was overseas, unable to protect her, unable to even know it was happening. The question was why. David walked to the living room window and looked out at the street. The rain was falling harder now, turning the afternoon gray and indistinct. A car was parked 3 houses down, dark blue Ford sedan, windows slightly fogged. He had noticed it when he arrived, but had thought nothing of it. Now he watched it with different eyes and saw that the fog on the windows was on the inside, which meant someone was sitting in the car despite the cold. Someone watching the house. Someone waiting. He stepped back from the window carefully, not making it obvious he had seen them. His mind was working through possibilities with the cold efficiency that came from years of operational thinking. Claire was gone. Emma was gone. The house had been left unlocked, the confession left in plain sight. This wasn't an arrest, this was a message. Someone wanted him to find this, wanted him to know that his wife had been compromised, wanted him to feel exactly what he was feeling now, the fear, the anger, the desperate need to fix what had been broken, because a desperate man makes mistakes. A desperate man becomes controllable. He went upstairs to the bedroom. Claire's clothes were still in the closet, Emma's toys still scattered in her room. No signs of a hasty departure, no indication of violence. They had been taken somewhere, but taken carefully, perhaps even voluntarily if they had been told it was for their own safety. He checked the bathroom, the medicine cabinet, looking for anything that might tell him when they had left or where they had gone. Nothing, in his own drawer. Beneath his socks was a small address book with no names, only numbers. He took it and went back downstairs. The telephone in the kitchen was a standard rotary model, black and heavy, the kind that had been in every American home for 30 years. He picked up the receiver and dialed a number from memory, not from the book. The book was for emergencies. This was something else. The phone rang 4 times before a voice answered. No greeting, no identification. Just silence waiting for him to speak first. "This is Kellerman. I need to speak with Foster." More silence. Then, "Hold." David waited. Through the kitchen window, he could see the blue Ford still parked down the street. The rain made everything look like it was melting. He thought about Claire sitting at this same table, writing those words with a hand that shook, probably crying, probably terrified, probably hating him for putting her in a position where men with badges could come to her door and make her doubt everything she thought she knew about her own life. The phone clicked. A new voice, older, rougher. Robert Foster, Deputy Director of Operations, David's immediate superior and the man who had recruited him into the CIA 12 years ago when he was still a graduate student with a gift for languages and a desire to serve something larger than himself. "David, you're back. 3 hours ago. Welcome home. Debrief is scheduled for tomorrow morning, 0900 hours. We'll go over your check findings, and my wife has been detained." Silence. Not the empty silence of a deadline, but the active silence of a man choosing his words carefully. "What are you talking about?" "She's gone. My daughter is gone. There's a confession on my kitchen table saying Claire cooperated with an FBI investigation into my loyalty. And there's a surveillance team parked outside my house right now." Foster's breathing was audible now, controlled but present. "Are you certain? I've been doing this for 10 years, Bob. I know what a surveillance box looks like. I know what a compromise operation looks like. And I know when someone is running one against my family. Stay where you are. Don't make any calls. Don't leave the house. I'm sending someone to pick you up. I want to know where my wife is. And I want to know what the hell is happening. Give me 2 hours. We'll figure this out." "But David," Foster's voice dropped lower, taking on a tone David had heard before, the tone of a man delivering bad news he wished he didn't have to deliver. "Until we know what this is, you're potentially compromised. That means you follow orders, you trust the process, and you don't do anything that makes this worse. Understood?" David looked at the confession on the table, at Claire's shaking signature. Understood. He hung up. 2 hours. He could wait 2 hours. He had waited longer than that in freezing train stations, watching for couriers who never came. In hotel rooms listening to conversations through walls, in airports pretending to read newspapers while tracking targets through crowds. Waiting was part of the profession, but this was different. This was his family. This was the part of his life that was supposed to exist outside the machinery of intelligence, outside the games of deception and counter-deception. Someone had brought the game to his home. Someone had turned his wife into an asset, his marriage into an operation. And whoever they were, they had made a mistake. Because David Kellerman had spent a decade learning how to hunt people who lived in shadows. And now someone had given him a reason to use every skill he had ever learned. He went to the living room and sat down in the chair by the window where he could see the street without being seen. The blue Ford hadn't moved. Inside, he could make out the shape of a man behind the wheel, patient and still, professional. David recognized the posture was the same one he had used countless times. The relaxed alertness of someone trained to watch without being noticed. But the man had been noticed, which meant either he wasn't as good as he thought he was, or he didn't care whether David saw him. Both possibilities were troubling. The first suggested amateur hour. The second suggested a message. David thought about the past 8 months. The operation in Czechoslovakia had been routine by his standards: meet with assets inside the Czech intelligence service, collect information on Soviet missile deployments, assess the reliability of sources, report back. Nothing glamorous, nothing dramatic. Just the slow accumulation of details that, when assembled correctly, revealed the larger picture of Soviet military intentions. He had done it 100 times before, in a dozen different countries. But something had gone wrong. Something must have gone wrong. Otherwise, why would someone target Claire? Why would someone want leverage over him now, just as he was returning home? He ran through every meeting, every contact, every dead drop and brush pass. There had been a source in Prague, a man named Antonin who worked in the Czech Ministry of Defense. 3 meetings over 2 months, always in different locations, always with counter-surveillance protocols. Antonin had provided documents about Warsaw Pact readiness assessments, good material, solid intelligence. The kind of information that could help American strategic planners understand Soviet capabilities. But in their last meeting, Antonin had seemed nervous. He had mentioned that he thought he was being followed, that his phones might be compromised. David had run his own counter-surveillance that night and had seen nothing unusual, but that didn't mean nothing was there. In Prague, in Moscow, in any capital where the secret police had unlimited resources and decades of practice, you could never be certain you were clean. Had Antonin been arrested after their last meeting? Had he been interrogated? Had he given David's name? If the Czechs knew about David, they would have informed the Soviets. If the Soviets knew, they might have informed their American counterparts through back channels, the way intelligence services sometimes did when they wanted to embarrass each other, to sow doubt and suspicion. Or they might have kept it quiet and simply watched, waiting to see what David did next, who he contacted, what operations he might compromise. But that didn't explain the FBI involvement. That didn't explain why American counterintelligence would target his wife with what amounted to an entrapment operation. Unless someone inside American intelligence wanted him compromised, unless this wasn't about catching a spy, but creating one. The thought was paranoid, the kind of thinking that could spiral into madness if you let it. But paranoia, David had learned, was just pattern recognition applied to threats. And in the intelligence world, the threats were real and the patterns were designed to be invisible until it was too late. He stood up and walked back to the kitchen. The confession was still on the table, still bearing Claire's signature. He read it again, more carefully this time, looking not at what it said, but at what it implied. The details Claire had provided about his behavior, the sleeplessness, the nightmares, the midnight phone call, were all things that could be interpreted as signs of stress, guilt, psychological compromise. In the hands of a skilled interrogator, they could be reframed as evidence of a man living a double life, serving 2 masters, slowly breaking under the weight of his own betrayal. But they could also be interpreted as exactly what they were, the normal stress responses of someone doing dangerous work in hostile territory. Every intelligence officer David knew had trouble sleeping. Every one of them had moments of psychological strain. It came with the territory. But once those behaviors were documented in an official statement, once they were part of a file, they became something else. They became evidence waiting for a narrative. Someone was building a narrative. Someone wanted David Kellerman to look like a traitor, and they were using his wife's fear to do it. The rain had stopped. The street outside was wet and empty except for the blue Ford. David checked his watch. 45 minutes since he had called Foster. Another hour and 15 minutes until someone arrived to take him to wherever this next act of the play would unfold. Time moved differently when you were waiting for your life to fall apart. It stretched and compressed, made seconds feel like hours and hours feel like nothing at all. He thought about Emma, 5 years old, starting kindergarten this year, obsessed with dinosaurs and convinced that the moon followed her wherever she went. He had missed her birthday while he was in Prague. Claire had sent him a letter describing the party, the cake shaped like a stegosaurus, Emma's disappointment that Daddy wasn't there. He had read that letter in a hotel room in East Berlin and had felt something crack inside him. Some understanding that the work he was doing came with costs that couldn't be calculated in any mission briefing. Now Emma was gone, taken somewhere by people who had told Claire it was necessary, it was safe, it was for the best. And Claire, who had spent 9 years learning not to ask questions, had probably believed them because believing them was easier than imagining that her own government would lie to her, would use her, would turn her into a weapon against her husband. David walked to the phone and dialed another number from memory. This one rang 8 times before someone picked up. "Yeah, it's David. I need a favor." The voice on the other end belonged to Martin Hayes, a technical specialist who worked in the CIA's Office of Technical Service. They had trained together, had run operations together, had saved each other's lives in situations that would never appear in any official record. If there was anyone David could trust right now, it was Martin. "You're supposed to be overseas. I got back this morning. Martin, I need you to check something for me." Quietly. A pause. Martin was smart enough to know that quiet meant off the books, outside official channels. "What do you need?" "FBI opened a file on my wife. I need to know who ordered it, what the predicate was, and where she is right now." "Jesus. David. That's not a small ask. I know. If I start poking around in FBI files, people are going to notice. People who can make my life very difficult. I know." Another pause. Longer this time. David could hear Martin thinking, weighing loyalty against risk, friendship against self-preservation. It was the same calculation everyone in this business eventually faced. "Give me 6 hours. I'll see what I can find." "But David, be careful. If they're looking at your wife, they're looking at you. And if they're looking at you, then everyone you talk to becomes part of the investigation. I understand." "Thank you, Martin. Don't thank me yet. I haven't found anything." The line went dead. David hung up and returned to his chair by the window. The blue Ford was still there, patient as death. He wondered who was inside, what instructions they had been given. Whether they knew anything about Claire and Emma, or whether they were just following orders from someone higher up the chain. In the intelligence community, information was compartmentalized, distributed on a need-to-know basis. Most people doing surveillance work had no idea why they were watching a particular target. They just watched and reported and collected their paychecks. But somewhere, someone knew. Someone had signed off on the operation against Claire. Someone had authorized the surveillance of his house. Someone had decided that David Kellerman needed to be controlled, pressured, or eliminated, and that someone had access to resources, authority, and information that suggested they were high up in the American intelligence apparatus, which meant David was hunting someone who could hunt him back. The afternoon faded into evening. The streetlights came on, casting yellow pools across the wet pavement. David didn't turn on the lights in the house. He sat in the darkness and watched the street and thought about all the times he had told Claire that his work was important, that it mattered, that he was serving something larger than himself. She had believed him because she loved him, because she had chosen to build a life with him despite knowing that parts of that life would always be hidden from her. And now that belief, that love, had been weaponized against her. She had been forced to question everything she thought she knew. Forced to sign a document that turned her memories into evidence, her marriage into an investigation. Someone had taken the one person in David's life who existed outside the machinery of intelligence, and had pulled her inside it, made her part of the game whether she wanted to be or not. David had spent 10 years learning how to lie, how to deceive, how to manipulate people's trust for strategic advantage. He had done it in the name of national security, in the service of values he believed were worth protecting. But now, someone had used those same techniques against his family, had shown him what it looked like when the machinery turned inward, when the tools designed to protect became tools of control. And he realized with absolute clarity that he had been living inside a system that consumed its own, that demanded total loyalty but offered no protection, that trained people to suspect everyone and then punished them for being suspicious, that spoke about freedom while building structures of surveillance and control that would have impressed the KGB. The blue Ford's headlights came on. The engine started. David watched as the car pulled away from the curb and drove slowly down the street, disappearing around the corner. A minute later, a different car appeared from the opposite direction, a gray Plymouth, 2 men visible in the front seats. They parked in almost the same spot the Ford had occupied. Shift change. Whoever was running this operation was doing it professionally with proper protocols and redundancies. That suggested resources, organization, official sanction. This wasn't some rogue operation, this was the machine at work. Headlights appeared in his driveway. A black Lincoln, government plates. Foster had sent his people. David stood up and walked to the door, opened it before they could knock. 2 men in dark suits, faces he didn't recognize, expressions that gave nothing away. "Mr. Kellerman? We're here to take you to headquarters." David nodded. He took his coat from the hall closet, locked the door behind him, and followed them to the Lincoln. He glanced back at the gray Plymouth as they pulled out of the driveway. One of the men inside was writing something in a notebook, documenting David's departure, creating a record of his movements, adding another data point to whatever file was being built around his life. The drive to Langley took 30 minutes. Nobody spoke. The men in the front seat kept their eyes forward, their hands relaxed on the wheel and in their laps. They weren't hostile, but they weren't friendly either. They were professionals doing a job, and that job was to transport David from one location to another without conversation, without explanation, without human connection. The CIA headquarters in Langley was a sprawling complex of buildings surrounded by fences and guard posts, hidden from public view by carefully maintained woodland. David had worked here for a decade, had walked these halls countless times, had sat in countless meetings in countless conference rooms. But tonight, as they drove through the gates and parked near the main entrance, it felt different. It felt like he was entering a place that had always been foreign but had disguised itself as familiar. They took him to a windowless conference room on the 3rd floor. Foster was already there, sitting at the head of a long table, a manila folder in front of him. He looked older than David remembered, more tired. Or perhaps David was simply seeing him clearly for the first time. "Sit down, David." David sat. The 2 men who had driven him remained standing by the door. Foster opened the folder and glanced at the first page, then looked up at David with an expression that might have been sympathy, or might have been something else entirely. "Your wife and daughter are safe. They're in a secure facility in Maryland. Emma thinks they're on vacation. Claire knows differently, but she's been assured that this is temporary, that it's for her protection. Protection from what? That's what we're trying to determine." Foster closed the folder. 3 days ago, FBI counterintelligence received information suggesting that you may have been compromised during your time in Czechoslovakia. They initiated a preliminary investigation which included interviewing your wife. The interview was voluntary. She was not detained, not arrested. She was asked questions and she answered them. She was pressured into signing a confession. She signed a statement. There's a difference, is there? David kept his voice level, professional. Getting angry wouldn't help. Showing emotion would only confirm whatever suspicions were already in motion. She was approached by people who told her I was under investigation for treason. She was shown photographs that implied I was working with hostile intelligence services. She was isolated, frightened, and manipulated into providing information that can be used against me. That's not an interview, Bob. That's an operation. Foster was quiet for a moment. Then, the information FBI received came from a reliable source. We don't know who the source is. That's compartmented even from me. But someone with access to details about your Prague operation provided information that raised significant concerns. concerns that required immediate investigation. What kind of information? The kind that suggests your last contact in Prague, a man named Antonin Kova, was not actually working for us. That he was, in fact, a double agent being run by Czech intelligence. And that the information he provided to you over the course of 3 meetings was carefully crafted disinformation designed to mislead. American strategic assessments. David felt something cold settle in his stomach. Antonin, the nervous source who had mentioned being followed. The man who had provided such good intelligence, such valuable material. The man David had vouched for in his reports, whose information had been integrated into briefings that went all the way up to the National Security Council. If Antonin was a double agent, then everything David had reported for the past 8 months was suspect. Every assessment, every analysis, every strategic recommendation based on that intelligence was potentially wrong. And David was the officer who had validated it, who had signed his name to reports that declared the information credible and actionable. He would be blamed. Not for malice necessarily, but for failure, for being fooled, for allowing himself to be used by a hostile intelligence service. In the world of espionage, being wrong was sometimes worse than being a traitor. Because being a traitor at least suggested intention, agency, control. Being wrong suggested incompetence. And incompetence could destroy an entire career. You think I was knowingly working with a double agent. We think it's possible you were unknowingly working with one. There's a difference, is there? Foster leaned back in his chair. David, I've known you for 12 years. I've recruited you. I trained you. I've read every report you've ever filed. You're one of the best officers we have. But this business, this profession, it's designed to make people doubt each other. It's designed to create suspicion, to make everyone look guilty of something. And right now, someone is trying very hard to make you look guilty. Then help me prove I'm not. That's not how this works. We don't prove innocence. We investigate allegations. We follow leads. We build cases. And until those cases are resolved, everyone involved is in a kind of limbo. Your wife signed a statement. That statement is now part of an active investigation. FBI has questions. Counterintelligence has questions. And I have questions. David looked at Foster across the table and saw not his mentor, not his friend, but a bureaucrat protecting an institution. The CIA was bigger than any individual officer. It had to be, or it couldn't function. But that meant, when the institution felt threatened, it sacrificed individuals to preserve itself. David had seen it happen before to other officers. He had even participated in it, had helped build cases against colleagues suspected of compromise. He had told himself it was necessary, that security required ruthlessness, that the mission came before personal loyalty. Now he was on the other side of that equation. Now he was the one being sacrificed. What do you want from me, Bob? Foster opened the folder again and removed a single sheet of paper. He slid it across the table. It was a polygraph authorization form, standard procedure for officers under investigation. David had taken polygraphs before, routine examinations that were part of maintaining security clearance, but this was different. This wasn't routine. This was a test he could fail simply by being nervous, by being angry, by being human. Tomorrow morning, height 100 hours. Standard questions about your contacts in Prague, your relationship with Kova, whether you knowingly pass classified information to unauthorized parties, the usual. And if I refuse, then we assume you have something to hide. Your clearance is suspended pending resolution of the investigation. You're placed on administrative leave. Your wife's statement becomes the primary evidence in a case that gets referred to Justice Department for potential prosecution. And Emma grows up visiting her parents in separate facilities, wondering what happened to her family. David picked up the form. The words blurred slightly as he read them, not because his vision was failing, but because his mind was processing calculations faster than his eyes could focus. Refusing the polygraph would confirm suspicion. Taking it and failing would provide evidence. Taking it and passing would prove nothing. Because polygraphs measured stress responses, not truth, and any skilled intelligence officer could be trained to beat them. The whole thing was theater, a ritual designed to make people confess not because the machine worked, but because they believed it worked. But refusing wasn't an option. Not if he wanted to protect Claire. Not if he wanted to find out who had targeted his family and why. I'll take the test. But I want something in return. Foster raised an eyebrow. You're not in a position to negotiate. I want to see my wife. 1 hour, supervised if necessary. I need to know she's really safe, that Emma is okay. Then I'll take your polygraph, answer your questions, cooperate with the investigation. But I need to see her first. Foster considered this. His fingers drummed once on the table, a small gesture that revealed he was thinking, calculating risk versus benefit. Finally, he nodded. 1 hour. Tomorrow morning, before the polygraph. But David, don't discuss the investigation with her. Don't try to coordinate stories or align your statements. The facility is monitored. Every word you say will be recorded and analyzed. If we detect any attempt at collusion, the deal is off, and we proceed on the assumption of guilt. Understood? Understood. Foster stood up. The meeting was over. The two men by the door moved to escort David out, but Foster raised a hand, stopping them. David, for what it's worth, I hope you're clean. I hope this is all a misunderstanding, that Kova fooled you the way he's probably fooled other officers. That the Bureau is overreacting to bad intelligence from a compromised source. I hope in 6 months we're having a beer and laughing about how paranoid everyone got. But until then, trust the process. It's the only thing that protects any of us. David stood up and followed the two men out of the conference room, down the hallway, back to the Lincoln waiting in the parking lot. The night had grown colder. The sky was clear now, stars visible above the trees surrounding the complex. Somewhere up there, Soviet satellites were photographing American military installations, just as American satellites were photographing Soviet ones. The entire world was watching itself, everyone spying on everyone, and somehow this was supposed to make people safer. They drove him to a hotel near Arlington, an anonymous mid-range place where government contractors stayed during temporary assignments. The room was on the 4th floor, clean and impersonal, with a view of a parking lot and a distant highway. The two men told him to stay in the room, that someone would collect him at 0700 hours for the drive to Maryland. Then they left, and David was alone. He sat on the edge of the bed and looked at the telephone on the nightstand. It would be monitored. Everything was monitored now. Every call he made, every person he contacted, every word he spoke would be documented and added to the file being built around him. But Martin Hayes was already involved, already at risk simply because David had called him. One more call wouldn't change that. He picked up the phone and dialed Martin's number. It rang 4 times, 5, 6. Then Martin's voice, careful and quiet. Yeah, it's me. Can you talk? Not really, but I found some things. Your wife's file was opened 72 hours ago by Special Agent Richard Brennan, Washington Field Office. The predicate was an anonymous tip received through FBI's counterintelligence hotline. No name on the caller, no way to trace it. The tip alleged that you had been observed meeting with known Soviet intelligence officers in Prague and Vienna. It included specific dates, locations, and descriptions that matched your actual movements. David felt his chest tighten. Someone had been watching him. Someone had known his schedule, his contacts, his patterns. Someone with access to operational information that should have been limited to a handful of people inside the CIA. Who has access to my operational calendar? Your immediate supervisor, the desk chief for Central European Operations, the deputy director, and maybe 3 people in operations security. That's it. It's compartmented, so whoever tipped off the FBI had access to highly classified operational details. Yeah, which means either you have a leak inside CIA, or the Bureau is running some kind of internal investigation without telling anyone. Either way, David, you're in the middle of something bigger than a blown source. This smells like a mole hunt. A mole hunt. The phrase carried weight in the intelligence community, a kind of organizational trauma that scarred everyone it touched. The CIA had been through them before, most famously in the search for the traitor who had compromised dozens of operations during the 50s and 60s. James Angleton, the legendary counterintelligence chief, had spent years hunting Soviet penetrations inside American intelligence, and in the process had destroyed careers, ruined lives, turned the agency into a paranoid bureaucracy that suspected everyone of betrayal. If someone had decided there was a mole, then everyone became a suspect. Every anomaly, every coincidence, every piece of bad luck was reinterpreted as evidence of treachery. And once the machine started looking for guilt, it found it everywhere. Because in the intelligence world, everyone had secrets. Everyone had made mistakes. Everyone had something they couldn't fully explain. Martin, I need you to look at something else. Antonin Kova, my source in Prague. I need to know if he's still operational, if he's been arrested, if there's any indication he was compromised. That's going to take time. Czech files aren't exactly accessible. Do what you can. And Martin, be careful. If they're building a case against me, anyone I talk to becomes part of the investigation. I don't want you caught up in this. Too late for that. I'm already in it. Martin's voice softened slightly. Listen, David. I've known you a long time. If you tell me you're clean, I believe you. But believing you isn't enough. You need proof. You need to find out who's running this operation against you and why. Because until you do, you're just reacting to their moves. And in this game, the side that reacts loses. The line went dead. David hung up and lay back on the bed, staring at the ceiling. Martin was right. He was reacting, defensive, trying to prove his innocence within a system designed to assume guilt. But the real question wasn't whether he was guilty. The real question was who wanted him to appear guilty and what they hoped to gain from it. He thought about the timeline. He had been in Prague for 8 months, running a standard operation, collecting intelligence from Antonin Kova. Nothing unusual, nothing that should have attracted attention. But 72 hours ago, someone had called the FBI with detailed information about his movements. And 3 days ago, agents had approached Claire with questions that forced her to sign a statement that could be used against him. The timing was precise. Too precise to be coincidence. Someone had waited until David was overseas, until he was out of position to protect his family, and then had struck. The operation against Claire wasn't about gathering intelligence. It was about creating leverage. It was about putting David in a position where he would have to choose between his career and his family, between proving his loyalty to the agency and protecting the people he loved. But why? What did someone gain by compromising him? He thought about the intelligence he had collected from Kova, missile deployment schedules, Warsaw Pact readiness assessments, Soviet strategic planning documents, good material, valuable material. The kind of information that shaped American policy, that influenced decisions about troop deployments and weapon systems and diplomatic negotiations. If that information was disinformation, if Kova had been feeding him lies, then American strategic planning for the past 8 months was based on false assumptions. But what if the information was real? What if Kova had been genuine and someone inside American intelligence wanted that information discredited? What if David's operation had revealed something someone didn't want revealed? The questions spiraled, each one leading to more possibilities, more suspicions. This was how mole hunts destroyed people, not through evidence, but through doubt. Once you started questioning everything, you could never stop. Every colleague became a potential traitor. Every coincidence became a conspiracy. Every mistake became proof of malice. David forced himself to stop, to breathe, to focus on what he knew rather than what he feared. He knew Claire had been approached and pressured into signing a statement. He knew the FBI had been tipped off by someone with access to classified operational information. He knew his source in Prague was now suspected of being a double agent. And he knew that someone high up in American intelligence had authorized an operation against his family. Those were facts. Everything else was speculation. He needed more facts. He needed to understand the full scope of what was happening, who was involved, what they wanted. And to do that, he needed to see Claire. Not just to reassure her, not just to tell her he loved her and that everything would be okay, but to find out exactly what she had been told, what questions she had been asked, what details she had provided. Because somewhere in her statement, in the specific things the FBI had asked about, there would be clues to what this was really about. He slept badly. Dreams full of conference rooms and interrogation lights and Claire's signature trembling on official documents. When his phone rang at 6:30 the next morning, he was already awake, already dressed, already standing by the window watching the parking lot for the car that would take him to Maryland. The drive took an hour through morning traffic. The facility was located outside Frederick, a low concrete building surrounded by fences and cameras designed to be invisible to anyone driving past. It looked like a corporate office park, bland and bureaucratic. But David knew what it really was: a black site. A place where people could be held indefinitely, without official acknowledgement. Where interrogations happened without lawyers present. Where the normal rules of justice didn't apply. They took him to a small room with a table and 3 chairs. The walls were bare, except for a mirror that was obviously one-way glass. A microphone was visible in the ceiling. Everything would be recorded, everything would be analyzed. He sat down and waited. The door opened. Claire walked in. She looked thinner than he remembered, her face drawn with exhaustion. Her eyes found his and something broke in them. Relief and fear and anger all at once. She started toward him, but the agent who had escorted her in put a hand on her shoulder, stopping her. "You can sit, you can talk, but no physical contact." Claire sat down across from David. Her hands were folded on the table, and he could see they were shaking slightly. She was wearing the blue dress she always wore to church, and he realized they must have let her pack a bag, must have told her she would be gone for a few days. Emma would have thought it was an adventure at first, a surprise trip. But Claire would have known better. Claire always knew. "Are you okay?" His voice came out rough, unsteady. "Emma's fine. She thinks we're staying at a special hotel. They have cartoons and ice cream and she's happy." Claire's voice was stronger than her hands, controlled despite everything. "I'm sorry, David. I'm so sorry. They told me you were in danger, that you might have been compromised, that the only way to help you was to answer their questions. I didn't know what to do. I didn't know what was real. It's not your fault. None of this is your fault. They showed me photographs. You with men I didn't recognize. They said those men were Soviet agents, that you'd been meeting with them, that you might have been turned. I told them it was impossible. I told them you would never betray your country. But they kept asking questions, kept showing me more pictures. And I started to wonder if maybe there were things about you I didn't know, things you couldn't tell me. And I got scared." David wanted to reach across the table to take her hands, to tell her that everything would be okay. But the agent was still in the room, still watching, and the microphone was still recording. Every word, every gesture would be interpreted, analyzed for hidden meanings. "Claire, I need you to think carefully. The people who approached you, the ones who asked you to sign the statement, did they tell you what they were looking for? Did they ask about specific incidents, specific dates?" She nodded slowly. "They asked about a phone call you received last September. 3 a.m, someone calling the house. You left right after and didn't come back for hours. They wanted to know if you told me where you went, if you seemed nervous or upset. September." David remembered the call. An emergency contact from a source in Vienna who had information about a Soviet defector. David had driven to a secure location, debriefed the source, filed a report. Standard procedure, nothing unusual. But someone had known about it. Someone had tracked that call, had identified it as significant. What else did they ask? They asked about your nightmares. Whether you ever said anything in your sleep, any names or places. They asked if you ever received mail from overseas, packages or letters that seemed unusual. They asked if you had ever asked me to do anything strange, like hold on to something for you or contact someone if anything happened to you. David felt pieces clicking into place. The questions weren't random. They were specific, targeted, designed to build a profile of someone engaged in clandestine activity. But the activity they were describing wasn't espionage for the Soviets. It was espionage for the CIA. Every detail Claire had provided, every answer she had given, was documentation of David doing his job exactly as he had been trained to do it. Someone was taking legitimate intelligence work and reframing it as evidence of betrayal. Someone was using the very nature of clandestine operations, the secrecy, the stress, the strange behavior to make David look guilty of the opposite of what he actually was. "Claire, did they ask you anything about Prague? About a man named Antonin?" She frowned, thinking. "They asked if you had ever mentioned that name. I said no, because you never talk about your work. They asked if you had ever brought anything home from your trips, any documents or photographs. I said no to that too." "Was I supposed to say something else?" "No. You told the truth. That's all you could do." The agent at the door checked his watch. 5 more minutes. David looked at Claire and saw his whole life in her face. 9 years of marriage. A daughter who still believed the world was good. Sunday mornings and quiet dinners, and all the small moments that made up a life outside the machinery of intelligence. He had tried to keep those two worlds separate, to be David the husband at home and David the intelligence officer everywhere else. But the worlds had collided, and now there was no separation, no safety, no corner of his life that wasn't touched by suspicion and surveillance. "They're going to ask me to take a polygraph," he said quietly. "They're going to ask me questions about my loyalty, about whether I've been working with the Soviets. I'm going to pass because I haven't done anything wrong. And then they're going to let you come home and we're going to figure out how to fix this. But Claire, I need you to know that whatever happens, whatever they tell you, I have never betrayed my country. I've never betrayed you. Everything I've done has been in service of protecting the things I believe in, even when it meant being away from you and Emma, even when it meant keeping secrets. It was all real." Her eyes filled with tears, but she didn't let them fall. "I know. I've always known. I just wish," she stopped, swallowed hard, "I just wish we could have had a normal life. A life where you come home at 5:30 and we have dinner and watch television, and the worst thing we worry about is whether Emma is eating enough vegetables. Instead of this, instead of men with badges and questions I can't answer and feeling like I'm living in a country I don't recognize." "Time," the agent said. Claire stood up. David stood up. They looked at each other across the table, across the distance that couldn't be crossed. And for just a moment, David saw not his wife, but every person who had ever been pulled into the intelligence world unwillingly. Everyone who had been used as leverage, as collateral, as a means to an end. The families of defectors, the lovers of agents, the children of traitors. All of them casualties of a war that never officially existed, but never ended. "I love you," he said. "I love you too." Then she was gone, escorted back to whatever room they were keeping her in. Back to Emma and cartoons and the pretense that this was all just a temporary inconvenience. The agent who remained looked at David without expression. "Your polygraph is in 30 minutes. Come with me." The polygraph room was standard chair with restraints for the subject. Sensors connected to a machine that graphed responses on rolling paper. An examiner who had the kind of face that revealed nothing. David sat down and let them attach the sensors to his chest, his fingertips, his temples. He had been through this before. He knew how to control his breathing, how to maintain baseline heart rate, how to think about something neutral when the critical questions came. But he also knew the polygraph wasn't really about detecting lies. It was about creating pressure, about making the subject feel like the machine could see inside them, could read their guilt or innocence in the fluctuations of their pulse. Most people who failed polygraphs failed not because they were lying, but because they were nervous about being accused of lying. The machine measured anxiety, not truth. The examiner went through the preliminary questions: name, date of birth, current assignment, length of service. David answered each one calmly, factually, letting his body settle into the rhythm of the test. Then the examiner moved to the critical section. "Have you ever provided classified information to unauthorized foreign nationals?" "No." During your time in Prague, did you knowingly work with an agent of a hostile intelligence service? No. Did you receive any payment or consideration from a foreign government in exchange for information? No. Have you ever committed espionage against the United States? No. The questions continued for 40 minutes. Some were direct, others oblique, designed to catch inconsistencies or stress responses. David answered each one truthfully because the truth was simple. He had done his job, followed his orders, collected intelligence for the CIA exactly as he had been trained to do. If Antonenkova had been a double agent, then David had been fooled, not complicit. There was a difference, even if the consequences looked the same. When it was over, the examiner removed the censors and studied the paper readout without comment. David waited. The machine's verdict would determine what happened next, whether he was cleared, whether the investigation continued, whether Claire would be released or held as leverage for further interrogation. Results are inconclusive, the examiner finally said. Some stress indicators on questions regarding your Prague contacts. We'll need to schedule a follow-up examination. Inconclusive. The worst possible result. Not guilty, not innocent, just suspended in uncertainty, in a bureaucratic limbo where nothing was resolved and everything remained open to interpretation. David had seen colleagues trapped in this state for months, their careers frozen, their lives on hold while counterintelligence pursued endless threads of investigation that led nowhere but never quite ended. I answered every question truthfully. Stress doesn't mean deception, Mr. Kellerman. It just means stress. You've been under considerable pressure. Your wife is being held. Your career is in question. It's natural to be anxious. But anxiety makes the results harder to read. We'll schedule another exam for next week, give you time to settle down, and see if we get clearer data next week. 7 more days of Claire and Emma in this facility. 7 more days of his life under a microscope. 7 more days of someone building a case against him, adding details, connecting dots that didn't actually connect. They drove him back to the hotel. He sat in his room and stared at the wall and thought about Martin's words. You need to find out who's running this operation against you and why, because the polygraph hadn't proven his innocence. The investigation wasn't going to end with someone admitting they made a mistake. This was going to continue until either David was cleared or destroyed, and right now the machinery seemed designed to produce the latter. He needed to act, not react. He needed to become the hunter instead of the hunted. That night, after the surveillance teams outside his hotel had settled into their routine, David went to the bathroom and ran the shower to mask sound. He took a small notebook from his jacket pocket, the one he had retrieved from his house, the one with coded contact information for sources and assets across Europe. He flipped to a page with a Vienna phone number. He knew the hotel phone was monitored. But there was a payphone in the lobby, and at 3 in the morning, the person assigned to watch him would be tired, less alert. David waited until 2:45, then dressed quietly and left his room. He took the stairs instead of the elevator, moved through the lobby like someone just stepping out for cigarettes, and made it to the payphone without the surveillance car in the parking lot showing any sign of noticing. He dialed the Vienna number. It rang 7 times before someone picked up a woman's voice, heavy with sleep. Yeah? Anna, it's David. I need to talk to Jacobi. A pause. Anna was Jacobi Rayner's wife, and Jacob was David's primary contact inside Austrian intelligence. They had worked together for 3 years, shared information about Soviet operations in Central Europe, built the kind of trust that came from mutual risk. David? It's 3 in the morning. I know. I'm sorry. But it's urgent, please. He heard muffled conversation, the sound of the phone being passed, then Jacobi's voice, alert despite the hour. What's wrong? I need you to check on something for me. Antonenkova, Czech Ministry of Defense. I need to know if he's still operational, if he's been arrested. If there's any indication he was working for Czech intelligence the whole time. That's a big ask, David. Czech files aren't something I can just access. I know. But someone is trying to burn me, Jacobe. They're saying Kova was a double, that he fed me disinformation, that I'm either a traitor or incompetent, and my family is paying the price. I need to know if it's true. I need to know if I was fooled or if someone is lying to destroy me." Jacobe was quiet for a long moment. Then, "I'll see what I can find. It may take a few days. Where can I reach you?" "You can't. I'll call you." 72 hours. David, be careful. If someone is running an operation against you, then everyone you contact becomes exposed, including me. I know. I'm sorry. Don't be sorry. Just survive. And David, Jacob's voice dropped lower. In this business, the guilty are sometimes innocent, and the innocent are sometimes guilty. But the truth? The truth is whatever the file says it is. Remember that. David hung up and returned to his room without being stopped. He lay in bed and thought about Jacobe's words. The truth is whatever the file says it is. In the intelligence world, reality was constructed from documents, from statements, from evidence that could be selected, arranged, interpreted to support whatever narrative someone wanted to build. David had spent 10 years building files on other people. Now, someone was building one on him, and every piece of evidence, Claire's statement, the polygraph results, the suspicions about Kova, was being added to a narrative of betrayal. But narratives could be challenged. Files could be revised. And the people building cases against others sometimes left traces of their own. The next morning, David was told he was being placed on administrative leave pending completion of the investigation. His security clearance was suspended. He was forbidden from entering CIA facilities or contacting current operational personnel. He was given an address where he should report for weekly check-ins with a case officer assigned to monitor him. And he was told that Claire and Emma would remain in protective custody until the investigation concluded. Protective custody. The phrase was Orwellian in its dishonesty. His family wasn't being protected. They were being held hostage to ensure his cooperation, to keep him from running or fighting back or doing anything except waiting for the machinery to complete its work. But David had no intention of waiting. Over the following days, he began his own investigation. He couldn't access CIA files directly, but he could talk to people who weren't officially part of the operational world records clerks, administrative staff, technical specialists who existed on the periphery of intelligence work and often saw things that field officers missed. He called in favors, asked careful questions, and slowly began to piece together a picture of what had happened. The anonymous tip to the FBI had come from a Washington phone booth. Untraceable, but the timing was significant. It had been made within hours of David's scheduled return from Prague. Someone had known he was coming home and had wanted the FBI investigation in motion before he landed. The photograph shown to Claire, the one supposedly depicting David with Soviet agents, had been taken by FBI surveillance, not by hostile intelligence, which meant the FBI had been watching David long before they officially opened their investigation. Someone had authorized that surveillance, had gathered evidence, and then had used it to pressure Claire into signing a statement. And the predicate for all of it, the original reason given for investigating David, was an allegation that he had been compromised by Soviet intelligence. But that allegation had come not from signals intelligence, not from a defector, not from any verifiable source. It had come from an anonymous caller who had somehow known details about David's movements that were classified at the highest levels. Someone inside American intelligence had manufactured this entire investigation. Someone with access, authority, and a reason to want David destroyed. Martin Hayes called on the 5th day with information about Antonin Kova. He's still operational, David. Still in his position at the Czech Ministry of Defense. There's no indication he was arrested or compromised. In fact, according to Austrian contacts, he passed information to one of their services just last week. Material about Soviet troop movements in eastern Czechoslovakia. Good material, actionable intelligence. David felt something cold and hard settle in his chest. So he wasn't a double agent, not according to anyone who's actually tracking him. Which means the allegation that he was working for Czech intelligence is false. Someone lied about him to create suspicion around you. Who? That's the question, isn't it? Who benefits from burning you? Who gains from having you under investigation, your career destroyed, your reputation compromised? David thought about the intelligence he had collected from Kova, Soviet missile deployments, Warsaw Pact readiness assessments, information that revealed Soviet military weaknesses, gaps in their defensive posture, vulnerabilities that American planners could exploit. Information that some people might not want exploited. What if the problem wasn't that David had collected bad intelligence? What if the problem was that he had collected good intelligence that contradicted someone's preferred narrative? The Cold War had always been as much about perception as reality. Politicians and military leaders needed the Soviet threat to appear large, imminent, existential, because that threat justified budgets, weapons programs, interventions around the world. But what if David's intelligence suggested the threat wasn't as large as claimed? What if it revealed that the Soviets were weaker, more cautious, less aggressive than the public narrative required? Someone might want that information discredited. Someone might want the officer who collected it destroyed, his reputation ruined, his work dismissed as the product of either incompetence or treason. David began looking at his own reports from Prague, reading them with new eyes. The missile deployments Kova had documented showed Soviet forces spread thin, maintenance issues with equipment, morale problems among troops. The readiness assessments revealed a military that was powerful but overstretched, struggling to maintain presence across Eastern Europe while also facing pressure on its Chinese border. The strategic planning documents suggested Soviet leadership was more concerned with internal stability than external aggression. None of it suggested the Soviets were planning imminent attack. None of it justified the massive military buildup American hawks were advocating for. And all of it had been in David's reports, filed through official channels, distributed to policymakers. Someone had read those reports and had seen a problem. Not with the intelligence itself, but with its implications. And so they had decided to solve the problem by destroying the source. David knew he was speculating, connecting dots that might not connect. But in the intelligence world, speculation was how you stayed alive. You assumed the worst, planned for betrayal, trusted no one. It was paranoid, unhealthy, corrosive to the soul. But it was also how you survived when the machinery turned against you. On the 7th day, he received a call from an unlisted number. The voice on the other end was familiar but unexpected. Robert Foster. David, we need to meet. Not at headquarters. Somewhere neutral. Why? Because I think you're right. I think someone is running an operation against you. And I think I know who. They met in Rock Creek Park at dawn, sitting on a bench overlooking the water while joggers and dog walkers moved past them like extras in a movie neither of them wanted to be in. Foster looked worse than he had a week ago, older, more worn, like a man who had been carrying weight he couldn't share. Richard Brennan, the FBI agent who opened the investigation on your wife, he's not just counterintelligence. He's also on loan to a joint task force looking at intelligence reform. Specifically, looking at whether CIA is overstating Soviet capabilities to justify operational budgets. David felt pieces clicking into place with the weight of inevitability. He's not investigating me for espionage. He's investigating whether I fabricated intelligence. Worse. He's investigating whether CIA has been systematically exaggerating the Soviet threat for institutional reasons. Your reports from Prague were too balanced, too nuanced. They showed Soviet weakness instead of strength. And someone on that task force decided that meant you were either incompetent or lying. So they built a case to discredit you before your intelligence could undermine their preferred conclusions. Who authorized this? Foster looked at him with something like pity. David, it doesn't matter who authorized it. Once these things start, they take on a life of their own. The investigation becomes self-justifying. Evidence accumulates. People who want to believe you're guilty will find reasons to believe it. And people who know you're innocent will keep quiet because defending you means questioning the system. And nobody questions the system. You're questioning it. I'm old. I'm tired. And I'm watching good officers get destroyed for telling uncomfortable truths. That's not what I signed up for. Foster handed David a folder. This is everything I could get on Brennan's task force, who's involved, what their real objectives are, how they're using your case to build a larger argument about intelligence reform. It's not enough to clear you officially, but it's enough to show that this isn't about catching a spy. It's about institutional politics and budget fights and people using human beings as ammunition in bureaucratic wars. David opened the folder and saw names, memos, meeting notes, evidence of exactly what Foster had described, a task force with a predetermined conclusion looking for cases that supported it. His case had been convenient. His reports had been inconvenient. And so he had been sacrificed. What about Claire? What about Emma? That's the leverage. As long as they can hold your family, they control you. You could fight this, expose the task force, prove the investigation was politically motivated. But that would take months, maybe years. And during that time, your wife would remain in custody, your daughter would grow up thinking you abandoned them, and you would be destroyed financially and professionally. Or, Foster paused, or you can accept a deal. Resign from the agency with full retirement benefits. Sign a non-disclosure agreement. Walk away, and your family comes home tomorrow. The choice wasn't really a choice. It was surrender disguised as negotiation. David could fight and lose everything, or he could accept defeat and keep what mattered most. He thought about Claire sitting across from him in that interrogation room, about Emma watching cartoons and eating ice cream while thinking she was on vacation. He thought about Jacoby Rayner's words, "The truth is, whatever the file says it is." He thought about 10 years of service, 10 years of believing he was protecting something larger than himself, only to discover that the thing he was protecting would consume him the moment he became inconvenient. I want it in writing. Full retirement benefits, sealed file, no criminal charges, no further investigation. And I want Claire and Emma home by tomorrow evening. Foster nodded. I'll have the paperwork ready by this afternoon. Sign it, and this all goes away. It doesn't go away, Bob. It just gets buried. The file still exists. The suspicions still exist. 20 years from now, someone will pull that file and wonder if I was really a traitor or just got away with it. Maybe. But you'll be alive. You'll be free. You'll be with your family. In this business, that's as close to winning as anyone gets. David signed the papers that afternoon in a lawyer's office, witnessed by people whose names he didn't recognize. Resignation, non-disclosure, acknowledgement that he was leaving the CIA voluntarily for personal reasons. No admission of guilt, but no exoneration either. Just exit, quiet and clean, leaving no trace except a file that would gather dust in some archive until everyone who remembered him was dead. Claire and Emma came home the next evening. Emma ran to him like nothing had happened, talking excitedly about the hotel with the big television and the pool and the ice cream machine. Claire moved more slowly, her eyes finding his with a question she didn't ask, but he heard anyway. Was it worth it? He didn't have an answer. They tried to rebuild something like a normal life. David took a job as a consultant for a defense contractor, analyzing foreign policy trends for corporate clients. The work was boring, safe, removed from the immediacy of intelligence gathering. He came home at 5:30 every evening. They had dinner together. They watched television. Emma started first grade and developed a new obsession with space exploration instead of dinosaurs. But at night, when Claire was asleep and the house was quiet, David sometimes sat in his study and thought about the file that existed somewhere with his name on it. He thought about Antonin Kova, still operational in Prague, still providing intelligence to whoever was willing to meet him. He thought about the reports he had written, the truth he had documented, now buried and discredited because it was inconvenient. Most of all, he thought about what Jacoby had told him. The truth is, whatever the file says it is. In the intelligence world, in the world of secrets and lies and carefully constructed narratives, there was no objective reality. There was only what could be proven, what could be documented, what could be filed away and referenced later as established fact. And his files said he had resigned under suspicion. His file said his intelligence had been questionable. His file said his wife had signed a statement raising concerns about his loyalty. None of it was true. All of it was real. On the first anniversary of his resignation, David received a package in the mail. No return address, postmarked from Vienna. Inside was a single photograph, Anton Unkova standing outside the Czech Ministry of Defense, very much alive, very much operational. And on the back, a note in Jacobi's handwriting. Some truths survive even when the files say otherwise. David burned the photograph and the note in his fireplace, watching the paper curl and blacken and turn to ash. Because even after everything, even after leaving the world of intelligence behind, he understood the rules. Evidence was dangerous. Truth was dangerous. The only safety came from having nothing that could be used against you. But he kept the memory. He kept the knowledge that he had been right, that his intelligence had been good, that he had served honorably even when the system he served had betrayed him. That memory wasn't in any file. It couldn't be classified or redacted or buried. It was his, and no one could take it from him. Years later, when the Cold War ended and the Soviet Union collapsed, and all the threats that had justified decades of suspicion and surveillance began to seem like distant nightmares, David would sometimes wonder if his reports from Prague had been part of that ending. If showing Soviet weakness instead of strength had helped policymakers understand that the enemy was not invincible, that the system was failing from within, that patience and pressure might achieve what confrontation could not. He would never know. The files were sealed. The truth was buried. And the only people who remembered what really happened were the ones who had been part of the machinery that crushed him. But on quiet mornings, when he sat with Claire on their porch and watched Emma play in the yard, when he lived the normal life he had wished for in that interrogation room, he allowed himself to believe that maybe, in some small way, the work had mattered. That maybe the truth he documented had survived even when he had not. That maybe someone, somewhere, had read his reports and had understood what they really meant. The confession Claire had signed was still in a file somewhere, her signature still trembling on official paper. But she was home. Emma was safe. They had survived. In the Cold War, survival was its own form of victory, the only one that mattered. If stories like this make you reflect on how fragile freedom really was, consider subscribing. There are many more Cold War stories that should never be forgotten, stories of ordinary people caught in extraordinary circumstances, of systems that consumed their own, of truths that were buried because they were inconvenient. These are the stories that don't appear in official histories, that exist only in sealed files and fading memories. But they deserve to be told, because understanding what happened then might help us see what's happening now.